Hey folks. Hey Mary, thank you so much for the introduction. Okay, great. I think we can go to our slide, which has our agenda for the webinar here. Oh, that's actually me. Here I am, folks. I dropped my email at the bottom, as well as my LinkedIn and my Twitter. Would love to hear from you following this webinar if you have any comments or just want to connect, want to learn more, etc. Okay, my next slide is the real agenda. All right. So this is what we're going to cover today. Number one, why do I need a risk assessment? Two, what are the potential benefits of a good risk assessment? Three, common problems and challenges. Four, we're going to talk about the risk assessment process, and we're going to leverage ISO 27005. Five, we're going to do some tips and shortcuts. And then lastly, we're going to talk about how tooling and automation can help us. I got my poll results here. It looks like there's a lot of folks that are fairly new to risk assessment, so I hope this will be valuable content for you. I think that it will. All right, so let's move ahead. All right, why do I need a risk assessment? Okay, I sometimes joke, hey, you have to do it, right? It's a requirement. And to make that clear to folks, I've listed some very common security frameworks, and I've cited, where they require risk assessments. So ISO Clause 6, SOC 2, CC 3, NIST cybersecurity framework. HIPAA has a risk assessment requirement. GDPR Article 35, that's a slight twist on the risk assessment, but when you're doing processing that may have risk for European citizens, you have to assess the risk to them. Then lastly, PCI DSS, for folks that are familiar with credit card industry, credit card processing, requirement 12.2 requires a risk assessment. I could go on. You can pretty much pick any security framework, and you will find some component of risk assessment and risk management. It's just a central part of doing information security. All right. So first, I'm going to talk about the benefits of doing a good risk assessment. This will hopefully get you excited to do one if you're looking forward to it in your organization. So first thing is it establishes a common context for risk management discussion. So what I mean by that is once you go through this exercise and you've documented these risks to talk about, you'll see a lot of assumptions, you'll see facts, you'll see things that you may not have been aware of, or things that you were aware of, but other people in your organization were not. And it gives you a foundation to talk about risk, because that's the point of this exercise, is simply communicating so that you can make decisions, which I'll touch on here. Okay, two, it brings together potentially disjoint elements of business and technology into a single view. This is particularly true about enterprise risk assessment. So when you are thinking about the job of an executive to manage their business, move it forward, make money for everyone, pay, so you can get a paycheck, there's a lot of different elements that have to be considered. And so when we talk about risks can come in all different places in the business. So you might have information security and technology risks, like we're talking about today. You might have a lack of patching on certain systems. You may have a weakness in your access controls, a lack of MFA or something like that. But at the same time, there's other business risks that are totally different. Maybe you have privacy risks. Maybe you don't have a good process for responding to privacy requests or DSARs. But then you have other risks too. Maybe you have environmental risks. Maybe you have, storage tanks that have waste that might be leaking. Maybe you have commercial risks like, your ad campaigns are not successful and therefore your competition is crushing you in, search results. Or maybe you have, who knows what, right? And so these can all come together and you can see, oh, geez, well, we need to put out a new version of our product, or we're really going to fall behind and, lose our big competition or lose our big customers to competition. Oh, but we also need to do information security. And you're trying to put those into a single view so that you can see what needs to happen. Now, we're going to focus on information security risk, but that's just the reality of managing a business, is there's a lot of different risks across the entire enterprise. Okay, moving on. It exposes assumptions about risk and priorities. So, and I'm going to combine this with it exposes vulnerabilities and weaknesses. So there are often siloed parts of the business or just departments, and they have a very clear view of what's happening in their part of the business, but other folks maybe do not have that same point of view. Or you might say, hey, this is what I see as the risk scenario. These are the threats. This is the risk treatment I want to do. And you may find, oh, actually, we're kind of already doing that, or vice versa. You may say, this is the risk treatment we want to do. And an executive might say, hey, well, I thought we were already doing that. Like we said, we're going to do that 9 months ago. And then it becomes clear to them, oh, well, we started, but we're still working on it. And, we need more resources and prioritization because we haven't got it done. So it helps to bring those things to the fore and make it transparent for everyone involved. Okay, next one. I love this one. It transfers accountability to senior management. Senior management is responsible ultimately for managing risk at an enterprise, but they can't make decisions on things they don't know about. And so, you might be a DevOps person and, you've been stressing about your change management process because while you have change management, it can be bypassed in some certain technical way. And you've been screaming about that, crying about that. No one seems to care. When you do a formal risk assessment, that puts it on paper, it puts it in front of senior management or executives, and it forces them to be accountable for those decisions that are made. And it also, shows that risk in the context of the rest of the organizational risk. Next point, it can act as an insurance policy for control weaknesses and audit findings. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, if you go to a SOC 2 audit or an ISO audit or any kind of audit, you don't want the auditor to find a weakness in your environment that you were not aware of, or that you can't show that you were managing. Because when we go to audit, we're not trying to be risk-free. No one is risk-free. Every business, enterprise, environment has risks. What we are trying to show is that we are managing those risks. And so if we take all of the weaknesses that we know about when we put them on our risk assessment, maybe those are hard things to fix. Maybe fixing the change management control is going to take 6 months of engineering. We can show, hey, like we're aware of that. We have a plan to fix it and we're working on our plan. We are managing that risk. And at that point, then you are doing your job and, that's going to help you in your audit. The last thing is the whole point of this is we are prioritizing risks so that we can make good and informed decisions. At the end of the day, that's what the risk assessment activity is all about. So good. Those are the benefits of the risk assessment. Now let's move on to some of the challenges, I believe is what's next. Challenges. It's complicated. Just follow this simple chart and you can do your risk assessment. Okay. Wait, what's aqua green? Okay. Middle. Wait, the reason it's challenging is because businesses are complex. Technology is complex. And so there's just this inherent level of complexity that we have to deal with. And that can make the risk assessment complex and challenging and hard. So that's one common challenge. 2, we're not sure where to start. If you haven't done this before, and this relates to the next one of unclear expectations. You haven't done this before, you get a blank spreadsheet, and it's like, oh, geez, what am I, like, where do I start here? What am I supposed to do? And what is this thing supposed to look like? So, a perfect example of this for me is for anyone who's done SOC 2, system description. System description is like a long multi-page narrative about your control environment. Well, if you tell someone that's never done SOC 2, hey, oh, by the way, write me a system description, it's going to be extremely hard and they're not going to know what to do and it's probably not going to be very good, which is why every SOC 2 auditor has a template and they say, oh, write me a system description and oh, by the way, here's a template and it's going to look like this and you need to tweak this, adjust this to make this appropriate for your environment. It's a lot easier to do something when you have something to go off of that is a model, right? Or it's something to copy. Risk assessment is the same way. If you know what it's going to look like at the end of the day, and there's going to be a lot of common elements that we're going to talk about, it's much easier to produce one for yourself. Another challenge is sometimes the scope isn't well defined. Like I just said, businesses are complex, technology is complex. What is the scope of our risk assessment? So if you think of the ISO framework, they say, hey, risk management should be a part of every project, right? Well, when you're doing your risk assessment, you need to have a fairly clear scope of what you're looking at when you're doing that. Now, if you're small or more simple, it's easier. You can maybe do the entire enterprise in a single exercise. But as you get bigger, you may need to scope it. You may have multiple risk assessment activities that take place that then get consolidated into an overall risk assessment. Another challenge, it's just too manual. Like I know how to do it. I have my spreadsheet, but it just like takes a ton of time, and like can't there be an easier way to do it, right? Can't I have some tools that are going to help me get me started, give me some ideas, populate the things that are true about my environment without me just having to manually fill it out. And then last challenge I'm highlighting here. Yes, there can be tools. Oh, wait, when you get the tool, it's an expert tool, and so it's too hard to use. So you need actually a week of training to use the risk assessment tool, and you're now introducing potentially another level of complexity in that the thing is hard to read. It's very, it's big, and it's not effectively communicating risk in a digestible, easy to follow format that, facilitates decision-making, especially for the non-expert. And in many organizations, senior leadership may not be information security experts. And so they need something that's digestible to help them make a good and informed decision. Okay. So moving on from this, we are going to get into the risk assessment process itself. Okay, so I've taken ISO 27005. There are different methodologies. Another sort of famous one is the NIST risk management framework. But I particularly like ISO because it's pretty detailed, but it's also industry and vertical agnostic, and it can be used to accommodate pretty much any framework when you're doing risk assessment. So I've put out the formal ISO components on the left. The chart is a broad representation of the risk management process. It's not exactly aligned to ISO. I'm going to talk through the bullets on the left so that we have a common understanding of sort of the academic approach to risk assessment. First off, let me highlight here, this is the risk management process, and I bolded items 2, 3, and 4. So in ISO world, items 2, 3, and 4 are the risk assessment, and this is risk management generally. And you sometimes hear those terms conflated, risk management or risk assessment. I don't get too hung up on the terminology. The point is we're just trying to communicate something about risk, but just to be completely accurate, that's how they think of it. So let's go step 1, establishing the context. Now, this is actually a preliminary step in ISO world that you do before you do your annual risk assessment. You establish the context of your business, and you also establish the context for doing risk assessment. So what do I mean by that? Well, who cares about your business risk, right? There are many companies out there. I'm not a customer of those companies. I don't get goods and services from them. I don't work for them. So guess what? I don't care about their risk. If they get a big breach and go out of business, doesn't matter to me, right? I do care about the company I work for and their risk profile. I do care about companies that have my data that I'm a customer of, right? So the point is, who cares about your risk? Well, you need to figure that out because that's going to help to inform how you're going to manage the risk, right? Who are your stakeholders? And these are going to be common things. Your investors, your board, right? Your employees, your customers, your partners, maybe regulators, maybe just consumers, okay? But clarifying that helps you to understand, your risk profile. Are you critical infrastructure, right? That's going to inform your risk profile. That's something in the NIST cybersecurity framework. They say, hey, well, by the way, if you're in critical infrastructure, you're a dam operator or you operate a power grid, like, let's figure that out because that has consequences for everyone in our nation. You know what I mean? So defining your context helps you to understand, a lot of different elements. What are the potential threats? Who cares? How much money do we need to spend on this thing? What's going to happen? What could happen and who would be affected? Okay. You're also going to establish the criteria for performing a risk assessment. So sort of a common answer here is you're going to do it annually or following a major change. And you're going to establish the context for evaluating and accepting risk. So I'm not going to go too into the weeds here on this. You can read it if you read ISO 27005. But part of what you're understanding here is, okay, once we have our risk identified and we've identified a treatment, right? That's not going to bring our risk to zero. It's going to bring it hopefully to a manageable level. And we're going to define what that manageable level is in terms of dollars and cents and who can approve it, right? So if it's a $10,000 risk, maybe any department head can accept it. If it's $1 million risk, maybe that's just senior management, things like that. So you kind of set the table, because then when you do your risk assessment, you can come back to this agreed upon formula about how are we going to deal with these things and make sure that you're aligning with it when you actually do your risk assessment. Okay, moving on. Risk identification. You're going to look at what are the assets in your environment, what are the threats, the controls that you have, your vulnerabilities, et cetera. And this is how you're going to come up with your risk scenario. So, and this is the part this is the hard part. So we're going to talk more detail about this, as we go further on in this talk. I'm not going to go too deep into it right now because I have several other slides that'll break it down. But once we've established our risk scenario, which is, I sometimes say that like the bad thing that could happen or the missed opportunity, then we're going to do an analysis on, well, what's the impact and likelihood of that? This is the classic ISO formula. And what that means is, okay, this bad thing that I've identified, this risk scenario, if that happens, like huge impact, right? We are going to go out of business. Well, what's the likelihood? Well, it's pretty low. Like, I don't actually think this will happen, but if it does, it's super bad. Vice versa, right? You could have a thing where, well, the impact's not going to end our business. It's going to be painful. It's kind of moderate. What's the likelihood? Well, it could happen, or maybe it has happened, right? So it's going to be a higher likelihood, lower impact, but that's going to help you come up with a ultimate risk score or risk level, which is going to help you to prioritize things at the end, right? Because it might be the case where you're going to deal with high impact risks, or it might be the case where you're going to deal with, high likelihood risks, but it's probably some combination, right? And so that's why we're coming up with this formula to give you an ultimate risk ranking. Next step is we're going to evaluate the risk, and we're going to say, hey, what do we need to do with it? How do we need to treat it? And that brings us into step 5. So there's 4 risk treatments that you can do at a high level. Number 1, the one we always think about, is mitigation or modification. That means we're going to do something to reduce this risk. We're going to put in a control, strengthen a control, etc. Option B or 2 is we're just going to accept or retain the risk. It doesn't mean it's not a big deal, but based on other priorities, we're just simply going to accept this risk as it stands right now and maybe deal with it again in the future, et cetera. 3, we're going to avoid the risk. We're going to just stop doing this thing. We're not going to let you, use your personal phone anymore, or whatever the thing might be, right? We're just going to stop doing it. And then 4 or D, transfer share. And this typically looks like an insurance policy. So we're going to, bring in someone to share this risk with us so that if it happens, we're not going to be fully on the hook for it. And especially monetarily, someone else is going to help us with that burden. And then last step is the risk treatment acceptance, meaning you've decided what you're going to do. Now, this is where the risk owner is going to sign off and say, yeah, I agree with that. And this is why you've defined it up top, so that person has authority and is competent to make that decision based on what that risk represents. And then lastly, there's these meta processes, communication, consultation, monitoring, and review. These are things that happen essentially throughout the process. We are consulting, communicating with stakeholders. And then once you've made a decision, you're going to monitor the effectiveness of that decision, or you're going to monitor, the implementation of those controls, that mitigation, and then you're going to continuously review it. It's an ongoing cycle, an ongoing process. Okay. That's the academic overview of risk management from ISO 27005. Let's get into some tips and tricks. First one, don't reinvent the wheel. This is where I was talking about having kind of a model to start from. An excellent resource that I've highlighted for you here, and there are multiple, but it's ISO 27005. Annex C has typical threats. Annex D has vulnerabilities. It's very well done. If you get the newest version, I believe it's 2018 version of 27005, it will give you a list of these are things that are going to be common to many, many businesses. It can be super helpful starting point and a thing to leverage. So I've shown here that, again, just some very common risks, threats, vulnerabilities. Your environment is going to have these same things. And so what we're doing in the risk assessment is not, creating something new, but it's finding which of these are relevant to you, and which of these are meaningful to you, and which do you want to prioritize. And not all of them are relevant to every business, right? If you're a software development company, OWASP top 10 is relevant. If you're just a service organization, consultancy, right, that's just not relevant. So, but you're not having to start from scratch. There are resources out there that can help you to get started. Okay, so I'm going to talk about how these tie together a little bit, because there's going to be some handy formulas in my next slide. Okay, risks and controls. So you have certain risks, and there are certain controls that mitigate those risks. And these are common pairings, right? So if you have, access control risks, you have, access controls you can put in place, conditional access, passwords, MFA, etc. Now, I'm not going to go into the weeds here, but what I'm going to do here is I'm setting up for you the sort of fundamentals, and then that will demonstrate how you can then bring tooling and automation to this process, and it'll be more clear for you when we get to that point. So sometimes it's hard to say, hey, what are my risks over here on the left? Interception in transit. I don't know. Is that a risk for me? And it can be easier to say, well, I'm not sure about my risks, but I am more clear on what controls I'm doing. And then you can essentially reverse engineer that. So we can see on the next slide. If you don't have controls, chances are you have a risk, right? So if you have weaknesses in your access provisioning and deprovisioning procedures, and you find that you fired a guy 6 months ago, and they still have access to the database, well, then you have a strong risk of breach of confidentiality, etc. And so it can be much easier to see the controls. And then when you take something like ISO or SOC 2 or NIST, you have the controls laid out for you, and then you can essentially reverse engineer your risk. And this is the way that an automation tool is going to do it in many cases as well. So I think we can move on from here. Okay, I want to give one more just tip about this, which is to say, just forget everything I just told you, forget all the academics. And this is just a little kind of basic advice that I think is super effective. Focus on what could be the problem. What's your gut feeling about your risks? Write those down. Don't worry about the formality of threats and vulnerabilities and this and that, but just put down what you are worried about, and then you can massage that into a classic or formal risk assessment type of a category, but just start there. You know what I mean? And then once you've done that for yourself, go to your team, go to your key team members and say, what bad things could happen? Ask them, write it down, set the context. This isn't a test of, what you're doing on your device. This is a process improvement exercise for the organization. What's the scope of your responsibility? What software applications do you use regularly? What hardware do you use? What do you worry about? And sometimes they're like, oh, I'm not really, sure. Everything seems good. A good context setting is, well, how do we compare to your last organization? And they can see, oh, actually, they did this one thing a lot better than we're doing it. Maybe we should do that. Once you have a plain language risk scenario, you can put it into the formal risk assessment format. Okay, we can move on from here. Okay, Matt, that's awesome, but I thought this was about tooling and automation. Okay, so I want to talk about how now tooling and automation can help what we just talked about and make it easier. First off, asset identification. So especially if you have an integration into your platform, you can automatically detect your assets. Configurations and misconfigurations can be automatically identified, and your controls can be automatically identified. Do you have encryption on your database? Do you have encryption in transit? And as we just talked about, if you know what your controls environment looks like, you can reverse engineer your risks. So your risk scenario can be suggested for you based on your lack of implemented controls. In addition, and if you don't have that, risks can be canned and categorized. I referred to the ISO document. You can put that into a software platform so that you can essentially choose your risks instead of creating them from scratch. Common controls can be automatically suggested then based on those risks. Like I said, it's a pairing. And you can produce a nice heat map, a visual representation, which can make this information easier to consume for the non-expert or for the executive. And then following that, you can build smart workflows based on the risk treatment option you've selected. So risk owners can be automatically assigned based on the asset ownership or even manually and then notified. Risk owners can just one-click approve treatments, and their acceptance can be tracked. You can also have a smart risk treatment workflows, which are semi-automated. Implementers can be assigned and notified. Tickets can be automatically created in integrated task trackers. You can have automated reminders and alerts. Risks can be automatically closed and resolved based on ticket status. And then lastly, you can automate metrics and KPIs. So the effectiveness of these implementations, how quickly work is being done, what's open and what's closed, that can all be automatically tracked with a risk tool. So moving on from that, that's the essence of my presentation. Vanta just put out a new risk tool. I'm just going to show a couple of slides to show how that looks in the real world. We can move to the next one. And you can come back and, watch this webinar recorded and take a deeper look at some of these screens. But there's buckets and categories of risks, which you can then select from instead of having to create them from scratch. Next one. There's a pre-built risk scenario library that you can choose from that's drawn from, common sources that are applicable to many different environments. Next slide. You can build your risk treatment, and then you can work to do those automated workflows like we were talking about. Automatically assign owners, notify them, send, create tickets in a workflow system that's, common for your environment, and then close risks based on the way that you are managing those tickets. And then last one, you can create heat mapping and make this a digestible, presentable view, for senior executives. So that concludes my presentation. I'd love to take some questions, if anyone has any. And thanks for watching.
Thanks so much, Matt. A few questions are starting to come through the chat, so I'm just going to read them aloud to you. First one is it important to integrate your risk solution with a compliance solution as well? What are the benefits of this?
That is a great question. I'm going to give you the classic consultant answer of it depends. So on the one hand, I would say yes, right? To the extent that we can integrate, have a common pane of glass, that benefits us. It can be, it simplifies things. You don't have multiple tools. And the information that's going to be relevant for your compliance is also relevant for your risk assessment. And you can do those automated findings, right, that I was highlighting before. So I think it's a benefit. That being said, you don't have to do that, right? So, if you have separate tools and you really love, one of them, they don't need to be together. You need to choose like the best tooling that you have available to you in your environment.
Another question is thoughts on how often risks should be reassessed, annually or something else?
Right. Great question. So for compliance purposes, annually is at a minimum. That being said, the reality is you probably have more than one, risk assessment process in your organization. That's relevant to what you do. So like if you are a software development company, you should be doing a maybe mini risk assessment or a very targeted and narrowly scoped risk assessment on major changes or security impacting changes of software. Or if you're going to open a new office, right? You should do a risk assessment for that project or that process. But for compliance purposes, you need to do it, minimum of once a year.
Great, thank you. Another question that came through: with automated risk management solutions, can external auditors also log in to see the risk assessment details, including the status?
I would say ideally, yes. You should be able to share that with them via the platform if that's what your platform is designed to do. In the case of Vanta, it certainly is.
Great, thank you so much. And then another question was about if this slide presentation will be provided after the session. So I can answer that one. We will be sending out a link to the recording following the session. Any other information, specific slide questions, please reach out to Matt Cooper at cooper@vanta.com. Let's see. Okay, one more question came through. How do modern risk assessment products automatically track certain controls? Do they integrate with systems like in my environment, like access products, source code, repositories, cloud providers, etc.?
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to give you I'll just give you the Vanta example so I can speak to that. So Vanta as a platform will integrate with your cloud environment. It will integrate with your task tracker. It will integrate with your version control system. And that's via a read-only API. So let's take the kind of easy example of your cloud. Through read-only API, we can track a lot of different settings and configurations. Encryption turned on, configurations, use of the root account, right? There's like a whole bunch of different things that are surfaced by your cloud provider that we can track, and we can either, again, create risks based on those or show controls based on those. Similarly with a version control system, we can check, what configurations do you have? What sort of branch protections do you have to understand what is the technical control around change management? So those are a couple, easier examples. Let's say you are integrated into like a security tool. We could test, do you have a WAF enabled? Do you have DDoS protection enabled? A lot of various things. And then in the case of the cloud, we can also integrate into their own logging and monitoring infrastructure, and then like surface some of those things into the monitoring platform.
Awesome. Okay. Oh, I think we have time for one or two more questions. So how about Is there an easy way or any tips of how to best map interdependent risks and controls across the environment?
I think I understand the question, and I'm gonna take a shot at it, but hey, whoever asked that question, if I got it, if I got it wrong, please re-ask it. But you know, one way we could do it is to consolidate the risks, essentially bucket them, because you might have, like in our environment, a lot of specific risks that have to do with the endpoint and different paths, different attack vectors on how an endpoint might be compromised with malware, which then could lead to access to our, production environment. But regardless of all those different paths, sometimes the solution or the control is somewhat the same. It's, antivirus, MDM, things like that. So see if there's any way to do simplification by bundling. That would be my kind of high level answer to that question. And again, if I misunderstood, please re-ask it.
Great. And I'm going to add this one last question because I think it's a good one to end on. Any themes or hot topics that should be areas to focus on this year that we are focusing on at Vanta?
That is a great question. Themes or hot topics. I would say privacy is a theme and hot topic that has risk in people's environment and, relates to information security, but isn't the same. That's definitely a space that we are focusing on for those folks in the United States. There are multiple new privacy regulations coming online in January, and it's already been a challenge for many businesses to do business in Europe with GDPR. That's also changing. And so that's an area that we're going to pay some attention to this year. Another hot topic I would say are, some new and novel standards. So, ISO, SOC 2, they're sort of tried and true. They've been around. ISO is changing this year. And so, making sure that we are staying up with the latest and greatest changes with the new controls that are, attempting to be more modern, specifically more cloud relevant. That's a change that we're focusing on at Vanta. The PCI standard also just recently changed. So that's something that we're focused on. And then there are these newer standards. So for folks that are in fintech, the OFDSS is a new standard. It's open source, backed by Plaid. We're taking a hard look at that, and we have some customers that are very interested. It's something that we're planning to build. And then we're also looking at things like MVSP, which is, again, just an open source product security standard, but it's very new, very relevant and modern, in my opinion. And I feel like that can address some of the complaints from industry insiders about, ISO being dated and, not super relevant, that sort of thing. So those are some of the highlights I would give, but that's where I'll leave it.
Great. Thank you so much again, Matt. And just a reminder to everybody online, this has been recorded. We'll be sending out a link to the recording, and it should also be up on our website in a few days, vanta.com. If you need any more information, feel free to visit vanta.com to connect with us or connect directly with Matt at cooper@vanta.com. So thank you guys so much for joining us again. Really appreciate it. Have a great day.
Cheers.